All right, we are at the top of the hour, so let's officially begin. So I'm Christine Bejerasco. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of WithSecure, and today I will be sharing about some of the major threats in the threat landscape and a new way of viewing cybersecurity. Because we are in the middle of a mass digitalization, and with 5G and satellite internet being rolled out, even as we speak today, we are bound to have a couple of billion people who didn't have access to the internet before to come online. And we even have 6G in the horizon, which should make us experience digital content on a level that was never before possible. So while this opens up a whole new world of possibilities, which will be bound to further accelerate the pace of technological advancement of humanity, it also widens the attack surface and brings not only benign and neutral actors, but also new threat actors. So, this has also been what has been historically happening already. And in the past 2 to 3 years, after working from anywhere, case in point, we're having a webinar now online instead of going to conferences. After working from anywhere became a reality for many different organizations during the past 2 to 3 years. Concepts like the metaverse, coupled with increased demand for environmental sustainability, could bring in a new age where people can live in rural areas and work seamlessly in a virtual environment. And these digital worlds that we are building today, they will be our legacy. Now, the question to us is that this world where our children will be building on top of, are we to be remembered as those who built houses of cards that are full of security holes or ecosystems that are secure by design? Technology today is evolving at breakneck speed. So there is a sense of urgency for many different companies to go digital, to cloudify, and to make their assets accessible from anywhere at any given time. So today we have software as a service applications. They're popping all over the place. And then various devices that are not owned by organizations are joining their estate. And industrial IoT devices, for instance, monitoring temperatures of buildings, humidity, and many new technologies built and deployed to make things more convenient, while at the same time, the old technologies are still there. So, case in point, on one hand, we now have Teams, we have Slack, we have Zoom, but good old email is still very much alive. Or, for example, for our phones, we may have Signal, WhatsApp, and Messenger, but SMS is still very much in use. I mean, we even use one time passwords in our SMS. And the challenge is that depending how old the organization is, their estate, like for younger startups, may look like hybrid network or fully cloudified network to very old networks that could be an army of Frankenstein's monsters. So it's no surprise that at any given time, most organizations don't really know what is in their estate, what are their assets, who are their users, where is their data, who knows? So calling this a complex ecosystem is an understatement. And of course, if we're talking about the attack surface, that is quite vast. So phishing threats, which have been around for the past 2 decades, are still alive and trending. And while at the same time, the threats that we couldn't have predicted 2 decades ago, crypto miners, for instance. So mining for new financial instruments that 2 decades ago, Bitcoin did not even exist. So in here, you have a spread of different types of threats coming from phishing, for example, a threat that has been more than 2 decades old, to crypto miners, a very young threat, all together within one organizational estate, simply because the technologies that we have, older technologies are not getting retired, and newer technologies that just keeps on getting added. And with these new technologies coming in and old technologies not retiring, the attack surface just keeps getting bigger. And a wider attack surface, of course, needs wider area to secure. So today, chief information security officers, for instance, and security teams in the organization, they are in charge of securing organizations who generate software that they don't build within their teams, These are the type of software that is being pushed out there, and they have little say on what gets packaged within the code. And there are many different threats, but there are three threats that I will be discussing and sharing about today that, when combined, they have the biggest share of our current threat landscape. So the first one is supply chain attacks. And supply chain attack is a problem that cuts through the very trust that we have with each other and the technologies that we deploy. This slide shows a couple of hundred supply chain attacks. This is actually just a fraction of the couple of hundred supply chain attacks that we have seen in the past decade. So this slide actually contains only the most popular ones that got wider coverage. But the thing with this is that it shows a trend that the problem is not going away. And supply chain attacks, they are sensible to a threat actor because this trust relationship between two parties, so the vendor and the customer, is already there. And this goes beyond just one-to-one relationship between customers and vendors, because open source code that may have dozens to sometimes even hundreds of contributors can also be part of our supply chain. So supply chain attack exploits even the way we collaborate with each other. And there are a lot of developers, there's a lot of coders within this group. So think about it. Do you even build software today that does not have any open source libraries at all? Like, these are questions that I typically ask in developer conferences. And when I ask them to raise their hand, if you do that, nobody raises their hand, because from SSL libraries to different types of encryption systems to libraries using geolocation services, the advice that has been given to us has been never reinvent the wheel, utilize what's already there. And these are already like very good libraries, but of course, there are also avenues for attackers to perform their attack. And going back to this slide, there's a very broad range of targets here. So unfortunately, no one is excused, because on one hand, you can see industrial control systems, laptop update facilities. So on the other hand, you can also see some operating systems here, IT management systems, and you can even have text editors and gaming software. So if you think of patterns, it looks like everything is very opportunistic and there's no clear pattern, which kind of means that every software that you take into your organization that is created by any other organization expands your attack surface and potentially makes that another point of entry to your organization. But in my stubbornness, I wanted to see patterns anyway. So engineer by background, I really wanted to see patterns and turn this into data. So I tried to group them into a chart to see if there are similarities, if there are areas that would look bigger than the others. And one realization that I had is that supply chain attacks that get the widest media coverage, typically associated with managed service providers or IT management systems, they are a very small part of the chart. And we have heard about SolarWinds and Kaseya, something that's very popular as a supply chain attack. And of course, it's easy to understand why these are very popular, because with IT management systems and managed service providers, they are embedded quite deep in our estate. They are able to install any software in our organization, therefore they can install anything, which makes it quite a dangerous way to perform supply chain attacks. But they are quite a small part of the population. Because if we're talking about volume of targeted software here, applications and utility software, they are half the problem. And it doesn't even include this others category where I am lumping into some gaming and web apps. So this actually reinforces our initial observation a slide ago, that any software can be used in a supply chain attack. So the costliest supply chain attack that we have seen happened in 2017, where a Ukrainian tax filing application called MEDoc was involved in a supply chain attack. So MEDoc was a required software for organizations who were doing business in Ukraine and needed to pay taxes in Ukraine. And at the time, there was an estimated 400,000 organizations that were using MEDoc. And in MEDoc situation, the attackers infiltrated the organization and added a malware called NotPetya into the MEDOC software update, so the SDLC. And once the compromised software update was pushed to the users of the software globally, so deployed to the software, NotPetya, which was the malware that was included in MEDOC, was installed directly to these target organizations via the software update. But to compound the problem, NotPetya had an additional propagation mechanism, so it can spread laterally through the network via a vulnerability that was not yet patched in many computers at the time. So NotPetya spread like wildfire globally. And if that wasn't enough, the payload of NotPetya, so the final point of why NotPetya was installed, was to encrypt the master boot record of the device. And if the master boot record of the device, which is loading the actual operating system of the device, if that's encrypted, then you restarted the device, then the device doesn't really work anymore. So NotPetya, the MEDOC supply chain attack, was actually quite destructive. And looking back, it was estimated that it costed globally around 10 billion US dollars. And mostly this was collateral damage because these organizations were not the intended target. Now, another supply chain attack, which is closer to developers' heart, was with a utility software this time. So utility software, they are attractive targets because they can be a necessity for organizations. And last year, this was with Kodikov, which was a code coverage and testing software. And in Kodikov's situation, what they did was that the attackers used an error in creating Docker containers to acquire credentials for Kodikov, the organization, and they used the same credentials to modify a script. And this is the script that was actually harvesting coverage reports and sending those to Kodikov. But what the attackers did was that they harvested credentials in the CI environment, so the continuous integration environment, and then sent those credentials to the attacker. So this is the modification that they did. And since MEDOC, for instance, it was very destructive, it was very public, it was very noisy. Kodikov, actually, the supply chain attack was very quiet because if you can imagine, they are just harvesting credentials really and sending those to the attacker without doing anything that seemingly is publicly destructive. And this is why the Kodikov supply chain attack took almost 2 months before it was discovered. And unfortunately, today, we don't really know the extent of the damage of this attack because beyond these organizations who were impacted, there is no follow through anymore. We don't know what happened next. Like, are these organizations using the same credentials in their CI environment as their production? So this could have happened, and we don't know. And this is the challenge sometimes of the supply chain attack is that the impact is not quantifiable from a public perspective, but the organizations that are impacted could really see the damage that are done into their systems. And I discussed a little bit earlier about open source libraries already. So this is an area that if you see the graph on the right, so the yellow spike going up, this is the area that's actually rising in popularity. Although this is 2021, every week this year, we have seen open source libraries that have different types of compromises done for them because of this type of supply chain attack. And this is getting popular because this is a very low barrier of entry. So imagine what the attackers had to do when they had the MEDOC supply chain attack. They needed to compromise the organization building MEDOC and then package their malware. But with open source code, you just need to either trick the developer to pull the wrong libraries. For example, if developer in Python would like to get URL lib3, you can create URL lib7, you can create URL lib alone, which has really happened in the past in a PyPy repository. And if the developer made a mistake to pull the wrong library, that could be the library that had the malicious code. So that is one trick as well for supply chain attack, in addition to dependency confusion, for instance, where the environment which is pulling the library update could pull first from the public repository instead of a private repository if your organization is actually using private repositories to validate these external libraries first. So this is what's happening today with this type of supply chain attacks. And the typical targets for this today are NPM packages. So they are favorites because they are, well, our favorite Node.js is actually like heavily used. And PyPy, as well as mentioned, is also a favorite target, but it's not limited to them because we have seen Ruby gems, PHP, or even Docker containers with this. And we're talking about supply chain attacks, and this is a combination of exploiting our frameworks for generating code as well as our relationships with each other. But these security teams, so the CISO teams, they're also tasked with ensuring that the employees are resilient against attacks on trust. And email-borne attacks, they are a clear and present threat that exploit the way we trust each other. So I have been in this industry, so my career has already spanned 19 years, and phishing has been around all throughout my career. And they are still alive and trending today. And they are not only even happening in emails, they're happening in SMS. There's even voice phishing, which we call vishing. SMS is called smishing. So there's different type of phishing. And there's phishing via WhatsApp, even phishing, for instance, via SaaS platforms like Salesforce. So phishing has just spread and like happened all over the place. And this slide actually shows that the range of phishing, so it has ranged from targeting financial institutions to different online offerings and even cryptocurrency. So various forms of financial instruments that didn't exist then. It all boils down to money being the primary motivation. But the interesting thing about phishing is that, have you ever wondered how spammers send out this content? Do they have a massive cloud setup out there where they're pushing emails from a singular location? Because that would probably not work too well because those IP addresses could be blocked by anti-spam. But think about it. If they use legitimate infrastructure, they might just get away with it. Until, of course, that infrastructure is blacklisted by anti-spammers. But since it's not their infrastructure, then it becomes a problem of the owner of that infrastructure. So one experience that we had a case with our incident response team, and they responded to an Exchange server compromise. And this Exchange server had open email relay enabled. So, which means that this can be used by anyone to send emails through it. And they also had IMAP and POP enabled. So there's no need for any multi-factor authentication for anyone to utilize this server to send emails, which of course is sort of like very tempting for those who are performing spamming and business email compromise, because it means that they don't need to set up their own infrastructure, they don't need to set up their own email systems. They can just use this very permissive Exchange server to perform their attacks. And in this particular scenario, the threat actor who utilized the Exchange server has been found to be a Nigerian malware group who have been linked to COVID-themed attacks, as well as business email compromise. And the interesting thing is that that was all that they did. That was all that the threat actor did in that email server. They just used it to send emails. No lateral movements going into the network to compromise the organization further, except, of course, that some of the emails were also going towards the organization. So in this scenario, the technology, which has not been properly secured, has been used to impact others, like not targeting towards the organization, but utilizing the technology to target others. So who knows how many people actually prey to this, will fell victim to the sent spam and business email compromise messages coming from this server. And speaking of business email compromise, so the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the US reported that this scam practice has costed 43 billion US dollars last May. And those numbers were almost double their pre-pandemic numbers in 2019. So within 3 years, this scam practice has shown staggering growth in effectiveness. But why is business email compromise much more effective than generic spam? So this is because BEC, or business email compromise, exploits the trust we have with a specific person rather than with general spam that pours you some excitement or gives you something to fear, and it's sent from a sender that you don't know. In one of our incident response cases, we have also seen a case where Office 365 has MFA enabled, so multi-factor authentication. But the threat actor, they use a reverse transparent proxy in order to perform an attacker in the middle type of attack. And this worked because the attacker served a live copycat version of the target application to the user. So as the user was inputting the data, the threat actor was capturing the data. So for instance, user entered username, the threat actor was there in this proxy page, which was sent via a phishing target. And the threat actor captured the username and inputted that username through another device. And then, since the user, so the victim, was actually doing this on the fly, the moment they inputted using the other device, it will trigger on the user's phone the multi-factor authentication. So the number for the authentication will be present, and then the user will input it again because the user is not suspecting this since it's happening at the moment that they are inputting the credentials. And therefore, the threat actor will capture again the second factor authentication and input that through another device. And in this case, the victim was compromised. The Office 365 account was accessed, and this person was now sending, so the threat actor through this account was now sending to the team malicious links. And there was even another business email compromise case that we have seen where a senior executive of the organization got a request for more than half a million US dollars to be wired to the attacker's account. So half a million US dollars, if you think about these values, they are quite big. But they're also the reason why this scam is so costly because they do add up quite a bit of these numbers. And email borne attacks. So from spam to business email compromise, even though a technology may be used to facilitate the attack, the human has a major part to play in this type of compromise. But there are vulnerabilities, there are holes, security holes that we have that are purely technological attacks. So cloud and server vulnerabilities are some of them. And I lump them together because from the perspective of a threat actor, it's really about the vulnerability of the application underneath and not about where they are hosted. So our incident response team also encountered one time where the web server compromise happened to a web server that was deployed in Azure. And this is the word of the cloud, and this is a web server. So we are painfully aware that every single compute and network traffic will affect the organization's operating expenses. And this was a cost which was previously invisible in the on-prem areas, even to the developers, the DevOps teams that are maintaining this. And in this particular attack, so this Azure web server attack, it was a vulnerability in the UI platform that was exploited to gain access to the host. And then crypto miners were then installed to this host. So think about it. This is a cloud. And if this would have been auto scaling, which is typically what we do with our web servers so that they scale down when you have less visitors and they will scale up when you have more visitors. So if this is the configuration, then essentially the crypto miner threat actor would be printing money because they can scale as high as the compute would allow. And for this particular attack, this was a vulnerability in the UI platform that was used on the website, which was exploited to gain access to the host. And this vulnerability was only 4 days after the publication of the security report and the patch, which means that without active patching work, the battle is lost. And then in addition to these crypto miners, there was even an indication in that same Azure web server of another threat actor, which was known to perform credit card skimming and other financial crimes. So it means that in addition to trying to maximize the cost of the operating expense to the organization and print money for their crypto miners. This threat actor was also trying to utilize this host as a platform to perform credit card scheming against others. And another compromise that we also responded to this time, it was on-prem, was with an Atlassian Confluence application. So the attacker compromised the server a day after the vulnerability was announced. So 24 hours maximum. And this time, the threat actor attempted to download crypto miners once again. It's an attacker favorite when it comes to these online computes that we have available. And however, so when the threat actor tried to download the crypto miner, the human, the admin that was in charge of this web server, has already done their due diligence by disabling outbound connections. So that minimizes the impact because if outbound traffic was disabled from this server, then essentially the threat actor couldn't download the crypto miner, which is excellent for the human being. So the payload didn't get executed. And everything that I've told you, so we know that these threats are something that we need to protect against. And then we go into problem solving mode. And typically, as a cybersecurity practitioner, I would leave you with these advices. So, for example, I would say make sure that you do security awareness trainings, especially for your DevOps teams. In fact, make them DevSecOps. Train them with threat modeling. Make sure that they can peer review each other's code for security issues. Help them with technologies such as secure code composition analysis or static and dynamic application scanners, and make them responsible for fixing the vulnerabilities in their code. So it's not the responsibility of the CISO team. Then to show our commitment to the company's commitment to the world, provide bug bounty programs to incentivize security researchers to report your vulnerabilities to your organizations and not sell them to the highest bidder. Because as we know, some of these vulnerabilities and the exploits that you can successfully create against them can be sold to exploit acquisition platforms where they can be weaponized and they can be used by different organizations against other organizations. So we would like to deter that by ensuring that we have bug bounty programs. And of course, for the rest of the organization, we need to make sure that we have multi-factor authentication enabled, the external attack surface. So every asset that is externally exposed is scanned, monitored, and has multi-layered protection capabilities. But the challenge with this advice is that the people who are holding the budget, so the C-suite and the board of directors, the CEOs, CFOs, CIOs even, their eyes would gloss over because of everything that I just said, and everything would go past their head. And they would be like, okay, whatever. How much would it cost? And after, if you have all of this and you need to implement them all at once, their eyes would probably pop at the cost that their security team quoted. And then the CISO goes back to the drawing board because they have been labeled to be confusing, they're not understandable, and cybersecurity is just so darn expensive. Because the problem is that what they are really missing is to what ends are we doing all of this protection for? How do all of these cybersecurity costs contribute to the company's strategy? And there's a concept that I would like to introduce today, which is called outcome based thinking, because we have been so used to thinking of threat based models and even asset based and risk based models, but primarily threat based models. I've been explaining to you in the past almost 30 minutes and talking about threats because we understand that yes, there's something out there that needs protecting, but how do we glue that into a message that we can actually get funded, that the organization would support this and we can do something about it? Let's take a look back at like historically what has been happening on this, because in threat-based models, this started because this is the language of defenders like myself who have been starting this industry. And these are the things, the vocabulary here come up from the things and expertise that we have and know of. And there are also models that can be used here. There are frameworks, for example, the MITRE ATT&CK framework, where you can pretty much map every technique, tactic, and procedure into a potential capability of a solution that you have. And for people working in cybersecurity, it works very well with our technical defenders. And another threat-based model is the Lockheed Martin kill chain, so which is a little bit more higher level than the MITRE attack framework, which provides an umbrella to aggregate the different attack techniques. But decision makers who have no cybersecurity background, even if they have a technological background, will be lost in a threat-based model. And this is simply quite so industry specific, so cybersecurity industry specific, which is good that we have the next level, which is asset-based models. Like for instance, Sony will use cyber defense matrix, where you have the NIST cybersecurity framework at the top. So it's like a matrix that you have NIST cybersecurity frameworks and then assets that go vertically. And it provides a clear method for showing where the defenses are per assets and where they are deployed. But defenders would need to be mindful, though, that this doesn't become kind of like a tick box that is done on a higher level, because some of these boxes go deeper than the others. So the higher level visibility can be misleading. And mapping individual assets can also still be confusing to decision makers. And therefore, another level, which is one level higher, is a risk-based model. And this is more understandable, like collectively. It's a little bit detached now from the technical areas, which are threats and assets. And this has also become a norm already nowadays. So there are models like the NIST cybersecurity risk management framework, which gives more granularity to specific areas. And the risk-based models, they have already been acceptable. But I personally have experienced that sometimes you can end up in your organization in a risk sprawl because there's so many risks. You don't know how to prioritize them. You don't know which ones to fund first, especially if there's too wide coverage on this risk. And their prioritization typically has been detached from organizational objective. And this is why I'm proposing an even more higher level approach, which is outcome based. So you begin with the goals and targets and strategy of the organization. And then if the goal of the organization, for instance, is to maximize revenue during revenue season like Black Friday or Christmas, then the question becomes, how can cybersecurity support that? What are the risks to these outcomes? And then what are the assets then behind the risks? And what are the threats to these assets? So you don't need to eliminate risk-based, asset-based, and threat-based. Just start with outcomes to make sure that your message come across to the people who are actually funding the investment. So some examples to show how this can practically work. Let's take a look at these three different outcomes and see how we can create a flow from outcomes to threats. So this is about gluing the conversation from the board of directors, the executive team, all the way to the technical people who understand the threats and would need to identify solutions for them. So first example, maximized operational efficiency, which is kind of like a very generic language that is understandable by the people in the C-suite and the board. And the question then would become, what are the risks to maximize operational efficiency? So one risk could be that since we're trying to be more efficient, we go cloud so that we only pay for what we use. So scaling up or down. The risk could be the cloud costs, where organizations' digital assets, when are deployed there, they could cost high operating expenses for the organization if they are misused. And the assets, of course, are the web server, for instance, the web server in Azure that we mentioned earlier. And then a threat could be crypto miners, which could elevate this risk and could even realize this risk for the organization. Another outcome is increased business agility. So teams within organizations may utilize software as a service providers to provide capabilities very quickly because we would like to acquire this capability fast. We would like to deliver solutions fast. Let's not deploy software on-prem. Let's use SaaS. And some of these SaaS providers, they could be riskier than the others if you don't evaluate them well. And some of these, we actually give customer information, personal data. So for example, we're talking about Salesforce, which has customer information, Workday, for instance, which has customer data. And if these providers hold PII, so personally identifiable information, that's an asset that we put in there. So a risk could be that customer data could be an insecure SaaS provider to the asset, which is personally identifiable information. And the threat could that could be exposure if that organization suffers a data breach. And then finally, the trust of the end customer, which every organization would like to have as their outcome. Of course, you want to continue to be trusted by your customers. And for organizations that provide software to their customers, that trust could be broken if they end up installing malware into their customer systems. So for our CI/CD pipelines, our DevOps teams, they are assets, and even our applications, they are assets behind this risk. And then the threats could be supply chain attack. And if you have this, you have business outcomes mapped all the way to threats, then the solutions, the ones that I mentioned earlier, the solutions could be easily mapped against the business outcomes. It makes it easier for the executives to understand, the C-suite, the board of directors to understand what are you really talking about, even if they don't understand the technical specifications of these individual solutions. They know that you're contributing towards specific outcomes that the business desire. And then probably they will end up funding some of this that would contribute to more outcomes rather than the ones that would contribute to fewer outcomes. And then you can have your ongoing discussion and negotiations with these executives. And the good thing is that once we get these decision makers in the organization to buy into utilizing cybersecurity as an enabler of business outcomes, we make threats such as supply chain attacks, email or software exploitation a thing of the past. Because we get better buy-in and funding for building ecosystems and organizations for the future that are more secure by design. Because the goals of cybersecurity, they are not detached from the goals of business. They're not detached from the goals of our organization. We just need to have the right kind of vocabulary and the right framework so that we can link them together. Thank you for your attention. So once again, I'm Christine Bejerasco from WithSecure. And if you have any questions, you can send those to the chat, or you can also click the upper right corner of this, which says like ask to share your audio or video so that you can ask questions through that. I can see that we already have one question here from Pogash. As a developer, can we detect, prevent such attacks? Definitely. So there are basic hygiene that we can do, for instance, in our CI/CD pipeline, such as the software composition analysis that tries to check. So there are already continuous checks if this is the most recent library, or if this is a library that looks like there is a supply chain attack in it, then you will just need to update, to remove, to upgrade that library perhaps. So there are tools already to try to help that. And there's also static application, SAS, so static application security tests. There are also dynamic application security testing that can be done with the code that is created, which helps even with code that you build in-house and not just open source libraries. So that should help with basic hygiene. But of course, beyond basic hygiene, DevSecOps is really about the mindset that whenever you build your software and you do threat modeling, are you really thinking about how your software can be misused beyond just thinking like how your software can be used? Because typically we build features and then we have unit tests to test how our software can be used. But we rarely think about, from a cybersecurity perspective, how can this software be misused? And DevSecOps thinking need to incorporate that into threat modeling sessions and even into peer reviews that the people in the team will be doing with each other. Because if the whole team is thinking about this, then you are going to be writing code that is more secure and more resilient against this type of attacks. Any further questions? You're welcome. Not sure if there are any more questions, or if anybody would like to. There's moderation here. If there are no more questions, then I guess we are done. Oh, Marek wants to connect. Sorry. There's one more question. Let me just check if I know how to launch this moderation. Marek, sorry, I don't think I was able to show you. Let me try. I think I lost her now. Would you be able to send your question via chat, Marek? Marek, are you still there? I think we have lost that one, unfortunately. Anybody or anything else? Anybody wants to ask before we end? All right. Well, hopefully I haven't missed anyone else. But Marek, if you have more questions, you can also just send me a message, like a private message in the chat. But if nothing else, I would let you go 3 minutes ahead of time. Thank you so much for joining. Hopefully you managed to get a thing or two from presentation today and enjoy the rest of the conference slash webinar. See you. Bye bye.